Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about Pandora's box,
Pandora's box, yeah.
which
It's a good one.
I feel like most people have at least heard of it, you know,
Yeah.
even if they don't really know the details.
Yeah.
But we're gonna like go deep on this one.
We are.
And I've actually got like a stack of articles here,
Oh, wow.
all about Pandora's box. And I've got to say, just in like the prep for this episode, I learned some stuff that I did not know before,
Oh, really?
which is always fun.
Yeah.
So for example, I always thought it was Pandora's box.
Right.
It's actually Pandora's jar.
Ah,
Do you know that?
I did. But it is a common misconception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to like get into like the origins of this myth,
Okay.
different interpretations of it, and also like why it still matters.
Mm-hmm.
Like why are we still talking about this story thousands of years later?
Right. Exactly. It's so pervasive, I think,
Yeah.
in our culture today.
Yeah. So let's just start with the basics.
No. Yeah.
Like what is the story of Pandora's box?
Okay. So the basic story, the myth goes that Pandora was the first woman created by the gods. And Zeus, the king of the gods, gave her this jar as a gift. And this jar contained all the evils of the world.
Oh.
And he told her not to open it.
Okay.
But curiosity got the better of her. And she opened it and unleashed all this suffering and hardship onto humanity.
So it's kind of like a cautionary tale.
It is a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more to it.
Yeah. Okay, so like what else is there? What else should people keep in mind when they
Well,
hear this story?
I think one thing to keep in mind is that, it asks questions about human nature, right?
Yeah.
Like, why do we do the things we do? Why do we make the choices that we make? It also looks at the consequences of our actions
Okay.
and, fate and free will, all those sorts of things.
Okay, so there's a lot more to it than just
Yeah.
don't open the box or bad things will happen.
It's simple, obey the rules kind of story.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about Pandora then. Like, so she was the first woman,
She was.
and she was created by the god.
By the gods, yes.
Mm.
Hephaestus, who was the god of the forge,
Yeah.
created her out of clay. And she was given all these wonderful gifts by the other gods. So Aphrodite gave her beauty, Hermes gave her cunning, Athena taught her crafts. So she was this incredible
Hold on.
creation.
Okay. So wait, but she was also given this jar full of terrible things.
Well, she was. And that's where it gets interesting because, she wasn't created to be evil.
Mm-hmm.
She was actually created as a tool of Zeus's revenge on mankind.
Oh,
So he had this plan.
so she was kind of set up.
In a way, yeah.
Okay. Wow. I hadn't really thought about that before.
Yeah, it adds a different dimension, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It makes you wonder, like, how much free will she really had if she was
Yeah.
kind of designed to.
Right. Was she just fulfilling her purpose? Was it her destiny or
Right.
did she have a choice? It's a big question.
That's a good point. Okay. Well, you mentioned that the jar itself is like a big deal, and like
Is,
I
yeah.
think that's something that people might not realize.
Right. Because we always say Pandora's box, but
Right.
the original Greek word that Hesiod used was pithos, which is a large storage jar.
Okay.
And somewhere along the line, that got mistranslated as box.
So why does that matter?
Well, I think it matters because, pithoi were often associated with the earth
Okay.
and burial rituals, and Pandora herself was created from clay.
Oh.
So there's this kind of
that's interesting.
connection.
Yeah.
So the jar becomes kind of a symbol of her own nature in the
Yeah.
earthly realm.
Okay. So it's not just like a random container
It's not just a fuss.
tied to her and like her story.
It's very significant.
Yeah. Okay. So then what were these evils that were released? Like what actually came out of the jar?
Well, Hesiod describes, a world that suddenly plunged into darkness. The crops wither, people fall ill, conflicts erupt over nothing. So it's like everything just went
Okay.
bad.
So it's like all of the bad stuff in the world
All
basically came from this one jar.
bad stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it wasn't just like physical things like
Yeah.
sickness or whatever. It was also like
No.
the bad stuff that happens
Bad
between
thing.
people.
Jealousy, hatred, despair,
Okay.
all of that.
Okay. So that's pretty bleak.
It is pretty bleak.
But there's also the thing about hope.
Right.
So like hope stayed in the jar.
Hope remained in the jar.
So was that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that makes this myth so thought-provoking. It doesn't give us easy answers.
Yeah.
It just gives us more questions.
Okay. So like what are some of the ways that we can kind of think about
Well,
that hope staying in the jar?
one way to think about it is that hope remaining trapped means that humanity is left to suffer without any solace.
Okay.
So it's a pretty pessimistic view.
Yeah.
We're doomed to suffer and there's no hope to get us through it.
Right.
It's a pretty bleak outlook.
Yeah. Is there like a more optimistic way to see it?
There is. Some scholars believe that elpis, the Greek word for hope,
Okay.
might actually represent something closer to deceptive expectation.
Oh.
So the idea is that if hope had been released with all those other evils,
Okay.
it would have caused even more suffering.
Yeah.
Because people would be clinging to false promises.
So maybe it's better that it stayed in the jar.
Maybe. Or maybe elpis represents something even deeper, like the ever-expanding, unfulfillable desires of humankind, the kind of hope that leads to constant striving and
Oh, so like we always want more.
always want more.
Yeah, and we're never satisfied with what we have.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So I guess it all depends on how you interpret that word hope.
It does.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the beautiful things about myth is that it's open to interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is already like blowing my mind a little bit. I'm like, I thought I knew this story.
That more than just children's tale?
Did not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Much more complicated than I thought. Okay. So we've talked about the jar itself. We've talked about like the evils, the hope. But like, where does Pandora fit into all of this? Like, is she the bad guy in this story?
That's a great question. And I think it's easy to see her as this, temptress figure who brought evil into the world. But I think it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
I mean, we talked about how she was a pawn in Zeus's scheme.
Right.
Does that mean that she bears no responsibility for what happened?
Right. So is it like she's completely innocent or?
I don't think it's about assigning blame.
Okay.
I think it's about trying to understand the complexities of the myth. Her curiosity is what ultimately led her to open the jar.
Okay.
But she was also a victim of circumstance, manipulated by forces beyond her control.
So is she a villain? Is she a victim? Or is it like
I think
somewhere in
I'm up
between?
for interpretation.
Right.
And that's what makes it so compelling because it challenges us to think about different perspectives and to grapple with the gray areas of human nature. It's not a simple story with a clear-cut moral.
Right.
It's a reflection of the complexities of life itself.
Okay. So this is just the beginning of our exploration.
This is just the beginning, yeah.
I'm already like really excited to get into some of these different interpretations.
I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah. And to see like how this story has been retold and like reimagined over the centuries.
Yeah. From, the ancient Greeks to today. It's fascinating how this story has evolved and been adapted.
Yeah. Okay, so stay tuned because we're about to uncover even more layers of meaning in this timeless myth.
We are. It's going to be good.
I'm excited. Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into Pandora's jar. I'm already like...
Pandora's jar! That's right.
Seeing this myth in a whole new light.
Yeah.
And...
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really making me think.
Yeah, myths have this way of like tapping into these universal truths about being human, like our fears and our desires and the big questions that we grapple with.
Right. Yeah, last time we were talking about that mistranslation of Pythos as box.
Yeah.
And like how
it's box. Yeah.
That really changed how people like
it really did.
Visualize the story.
The imagery is completely different.
Yeah. And we also talked about the hope that was left in the jar.
Elpis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, was it a good thing or a bad thing?
Right. Was humanity better off with hope trapped inside, or would it have been worse if it had been unleashed with all the other evils? We also started to unpack Pandora's character. Yeah. Like, was she a villain or a victim or something in between?
Right. That was really interesting to think about.
Yeah. And the myth leaves a lot of room for interpretation there.
Yeah, it does. It doesn't give us any easy answers, which is part of why I think it's so...
I think so, too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, okay. I was thinking about Pandora.
Yeah.
And like how she's often compared to Eve.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic comparison.
It's from the Bible.
Yeah.
And it's like they both kind of get blamed for like bringing suffering into the world.
Two powerful women who get a bad rap.
Yeah. So what's up with that? Like, why are these stories?
Well, I think it's fascinating how these stories from such different cultures and time periods still echo the same themes, They're both about these like perfect creations whose curiosity gets the best of them and leads to these like disastrous consequences for all of humanity.
So Pandora opens the jar Eve takes a bite of the apple, and boom,
The world changes.
bad stuff happens.
Yes. Paradise lost.
Yeah. But it's not just what they did right. It's also like how they're portrayed.
Exactly. And I think there's often a tendency to blame them.
Yeah.
You know, like they're these temptresses who like brought about mankind's downfall.
It just seems kind of unfair to pin it all on them.
Yeah.
Like Pandora was manipulated by Zeus.
Right.
And Eve was tempted by the serpent. Like, it's important to remember that they weren't acting in a vacuum.
Exactly. It's all about context.
Yeah.
And I think rather than just focusing on blame,
Yeah.
we can view these myths as reflections of like deeper anxieties about human nature itself.
Okay. So, like, what are some of those anxieties?
Well, you know, like the allure of knowledge,
Okay.
for one thing. You know, that desire to know more than we're maybe supposed to.
Right.
And then the consequences of our choices, both good and bad.
So, like, it's not just about Pandora and Eve.
It's not just.
It's about, like, all of us.
It's about all of us.
And, like, the choices that we make.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And our capacity for both good and evil.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely relate to that.
I too.
Like that feeling of wanting to know more.
Yeah.
Even if it might lead to trouble.
Curiosity killed the cat. Right.
Yeah. But like satisfaction brought it back.
That's the thing. Right. Yeah.
Okay. So we were talking about these evils that were released from the jar.
Right.
And like all the suffering that came into the world.
Yeah.
I was reading this article.
Okay.
And it talked about how those evils
Mm.
might not have actually been like all bad.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it said that the Greek word that's often translated as evils
Mm-hmm.
could also be interpreted as gifts.
Interesting.
So like not necessarily good gifts,
Right.
but gifts nonetheless.
Huh. So not just plagues and sorrows, but like
Yeah.
abilities,
Yeah.
potentials. That's a new way of looking at it.
Yeah. Like things like strife, jealousy,
Yeah.
even death. Like
Yeah.
these are all part of the human experience.
They are. They're not inherently good or bad.
Right. It's like how we choose to
It's how we
engage with them
them.
that matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's not like the jar was filled with like pure evil.
Right.
It was more like
the full spectrum
Yeah,
of
yeah.
human experience.
like the good
Yeah.
and the bad
The light and the dark.
all mixed up together.
It's like the yin and yang of life.
right.
You
Yeah.
can't have one without the other.
So maybe Pandora's story isn't just about like avoiding suffering.
Maybe not. Maybe.
Maybe it's about like accepting
Like it's about embracing.
the full spectrum
Yeah.
of the whole experience
Enchilada.
with all of its complexities
Yeah.
and contradictions.
And I think that's a really powerful way to look at it, you know?
Yeah, it really makes you think differently
It does.
about those things that we usually try to.
Yeah. We tend to label things as good or bad, but maybe it's more about recognizing that both are essential
Yeah,
parts of a greater whole.
it's like, what if embracing those gifts could actually.
Lead to greater understanding and growth.
It's a question worth pondering, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground so far.
We have.
Like the mistranslation of Pythos,
Yeah.
the evils as gifts. But I really want to like dive deeper into the symbolism of the jar itself. Like
Oh,
it just
it's-
seems so important
It is. It's a very potent image.
to the story.
Yeah, and it represents so much more than just a container, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so like what else does it symbolize?
Well, it represents Pandora herself, for one thing, you know, created from clay,
Okay.
connected to the earth.
Yeah.
It also represents the human psyche,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that inner space where we all have the potential for both
Right.
good and evil.
Like a container for
Yeah, like a container for all the
there-
stuff that makes us human.
that's inside of us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I am ready to crack open.
Let's do it. That jar of symbolism and see what we find. Welcome back to our deep dive on Pandora's jar. So much to unpack here. We've talked about the mistranslations, the hope, the evils, and I'm really fascinated by the symbolism of the jar itself.
The jar itself.
You know, I feel like there's so much more to explore there.
There is. The jar is a multifaceted symbol. Like we said, it represents Pandora herself, her creation from clay, the earth, and the potential for both creation and destruction that lies within us all. It's a reminder that even the most beautiful things can contain darkness, and that darkness itself can hold the seeds of transformation.
I like that, the seeds of transformation.
Yeah.
It's like a microcosm of the world,
Yeah.
full of contradictions, you know,
Yeah.
complexities.
Yeah.
We talked about how pithoi were associated with burial rituals in ancient Greece.
Right.
That seems really significant given the themes of death and suffering in the Pandora myth.
Exactly. And during the Anthesteria, that ancient Greek festival honoring Dionysus, Pythoi played a central role. They were used to hold offerings for the dead, and the festival itself was a time when the boundary between the living and the underworld was believed to be thin. A time of both celebration and mourning, honoring the past and embracing the cycle of life and death.
It's interesting, like opening the jar in the Pandora myth
Mm-hmm.
kind of mirrors that ritualistic opening of the Pythoi during the Anthesteria
Yeah.
to appease and release spirits. Like both are tapping into this primal fear of the unknown.
It's like this liminal space, that threshold between life and death, the known and the unknown. A reminder that we're always navigating that delicate balance, that darkness and light, joy and sorrow, creation and destruction, they're all intertwined.
It's amazing to me how this myth still resonates with us today.
I know, it's incredible.
Like we still have those same anxieties about the unknown, about the consequences of our actions.
Yeah.
Like every generation seems to find new meaning in this story.
Well, it's a timeless reflection of the human condition, right? Our deepest fears and desires, our longing for understanding, and our struggle to reconcile the paradoxes of existence.
So we've covered so much in this deep dive.
Hmm.
The mistranslations, the hope, the evils, the parallels to Eve, the symbolism of the jar.
A lot.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
What stands out to you as like the biggest takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that myths are not just stories.
Yeah.
They're mirrors reflecting our own psyches and the timeless questions we wrestle with as human beings.
I like that.
The Pandora myth in particular challenges us to embrace complexity, to recognize that light and darkness coexist within us all, and to approach life's mysteries with both curiosity and a healthy dose of caution.
Well said. So as we wrap up, I keep thinking about that question the myth asks. If Pandora's jar were to be found today, would we open it knowing the consequences?
Oh, that's a good one.
Would curiosity outweigh the risk? Or would we leave the unknown undisturbed?
It really makes you think.
It does. Like, what would you do?
I don't know. It's a tough one. It's like all the choices we face in life. Do we embrace the unknown with all its risks and rewards? Or do we stick with the familiar, even if it means limiting our potential? Tough choices.
Yeah. No easy answers.
No easy answers. It's the journey.
The journey. Yeah. Well, this has been an amazing exploration of the Pandora myth.
It really has.
I'm so glad we did this deep dive.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep